Sorry.
Hey, podcast listeners, it's Ria Wong with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, my guest is Mitch Stein, who is the co founder and CEO of Pond, and we are talking about tips for community building. So, it's going to be an interesting conversation because Pond is actually not a nonprofit, but you serve nonprofits. We'll talk all about that. So, welcome, Mitch.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here.
It is so exciting to see you here because you're one of these people who like pops up on my LinkedIn feed like all the time. And I was like, why don't I talk to Mitch? Mitch should be on the pod. So before we jump into it, Mitch, tell us a little bit about your unconventional path to nonprofit.
Yeah, it's a great way to start. I was actually just chatting with someone this morning who was like, whenever I talk to people like you that are trying to start startups in the nonprofit space, I can't help but get protective and think like, this is my world. And you, and they're like, but I get it. I get it. So I realize there's always like some of that head scratching around how people got here. But no, I was an investment banker for 7 years. I worked at Goldman Sachs in a few different jobs there. But I was getting really involved in the nonprofit world just as a fundraiser and a board member at the LGBT Center here in New York. Um, I joined their event Cycle for the Cause, the Northeast AIDS Ride, which is a 275-mile bike ride from Boston to New York. I'd lost my uncle Marlon to AIDS, and so my dad and I joined that event together, and it was really my first big like event I'd done in this world, and just completely fell in love. And so it became this huge passion project, and I mean, it changed my life. It changed my relationship with my family. It was just really amazing to see the impact that that community could have on on me, on my family, on the people around me. And I just knew I wanted to do more and be connected. I also got very frustrated with the technology platform they were using to run the bike ride on. And I covered technology companies as a banker. Not that that makes me a technologist, but I was at least like familiar with the space. And I was like, come on, there has to be something better out there. And as I learned and talked more with the organization, I heard about they were stuck in this bad contract they couldn't get out of, and how much of a pain it was to find something new. And I just started asking around to friends and people at other organizations. And it was just this shared experience over and over again. Whenever I have to search for software or something for my nonprofit or a new vendor, it's this huge rigmarole. It feels like we're reinventing the wheel every time. We don't really know what to do. These big decisions take forever. And I just felt like there could be a better solution for an enormous market. We all know the nonprofit space is huge, and it's super fragmented, in every local county across the country. And it's fragmented on both sides of that market. You think about the nonprofit as the buyer, and then all the vendors they're buying things from to run their organizations. Those are also localized into different places. And that from a business perspective always screams like, oh, this is an opportunity for a market that can be better organized into a digital platform. How much better would it be if this experience was like travel or buying a car, the same as picking the vendors and utilizing them to run your organization? Because today it's kind of a black box, and it's really reliant on calling a friend. And we know that that leaves tons of room for poor decisions, spending too much money, and just that lack of transparency definitely doesn't benefit the nonprofits just trying to do the right thing and run their organizations well. And it certainly doesn't benefit vendors that are trying to sell into the market. And it's super, super challenging to go to market and kind of sell to this customer base. So that was like the nugget, the idea, the aspiration. I ended up deciding to leave my job after I'd pitched Goldman on a nonprofit banking product that they could build, and actually got through this whole accelerator process. And I thought that was going to be my new life, like my new job as a kind of a product leader internally and be an entrepreneur. And at the very last step, we didn't get funded. And I was devastated, totally devastated, because I'd had a taste of doing something really, really meaningful that I was really excited about, and then kind of had that taken away. And it was back to my pretty grueling job that I just started disliking more and more. And so I made a plan. I was like, I'm going to quit, and it's going to be in 5 months, and I'll figure out the business in the meantime. I know I can do something out there. Like, look, people start companies all the time. Why couldn't it be me? Some of that naivete I think you have to have as an entrepreneur. And so I put in my 2 weeks notice, and I left, and I had this whole plan. I had 2 partners lined up I was going to work with and beta test here in New York. And then the entire world shut down. There was this little thing that the pandemic that happened about 5 days after I'd left. And so I ended up moving home with my parents in Indiana. I was supposed to be there for a few weeks. I was there for 2 years. So did the true like startup in the parents' garage / like childhood bedroom for a long time, and happy to go more into like what we're doing with Pond and where we've been, but that is the winding path that brought me to the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you shared that because it's never a straight line. And before we started recording, actually, I was telling Mitch that I had also thought about doing something similar, starting a two-sided marketplace where vendors and nonprofits could find each other. And it's really hard. I abandoned it, but I still think it's a good idea. So I'm so glad, Mitch, that you're doing it. And I wish we'd met earlier so we could have chatted about it. But tell us like really briefly about what Pond does, and then let's talk about community building. So big picture, high level, what is Pond?
Yeah, so it's a lot like an Angie's List, but for all the business needs of a nonprofit. So just like you'd post a need for a handyman to come mount your TV, we're trying to create a similar environment where you can post a need for a new kind of software, a certain type of consultant, some training you need, a part-time grant writer, like anything that I just like to describe the business investments and business needs that run the organization. So we work with bringing a whole host of those kinds of vendors over across 100 different categories. We have several hundred vendors on the platform, and then nonprofits can come and post those projects. Vendors that are in the relevant categories get alerted so they can respond and tell you about what they do. And then you can send follow-up questions and vet them directly through the platform. So it gives a super streamlined discovery and vetting process. And then we help along the way as people are meeting with folks. They give us feedback, who they're liking, who they're not. If they need help pitching to the board or talking to another user of that product or service, those are all things that we kind of assist with to streamline the process. People also build up credits on the platform as they're taking these meetings and giving us feedback that they just get as a cash rebate once they make a purchase decision. So really trying to streamline the process, incentivize good engagement and feedback from everybody, and make things cheaper for people on both sides of the market. Because like I said, that customer discovery is really hard and expensive for vendors too. And that's the business model. When they win new business, we take a percentage of their new contract, just as kind of a standard referral or affiliate fee model that so many people in the space use. And then part of that is what we give as a rebate to the nonprofit to lower their cost for the service.
Got it. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this notion of community, because one of the reasons why this model is really hard is that you're building a two-sided marketplace. So as you're thinking about how you've built Pond so far, what have you noticed are the specific characteristics of working or selling to nonprofits? Because I think I've talked about this with my friends, Jess Campbell and Cindy Wagman. Selling to nonprofits is a different beast. So curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and it's also so variable, right? Like and I mentioned this earlier about the fragmentation, but people are also different in New York than they are in Indiana, than they are in San Diego. And there's nuances about each of those markets too, which are really interesting. But by and large, a lot of what I've learned and what we've learned as a team over the past 2.5 years, and a lot of this, any kind of feedback or advice I'll give in this conversation is just like we've been experimenting and learning and still learning. So definitely don't have all the answers, but happy to share things we've observed or learned. I think there is an assumption that from a lot of people that folks at nonprofits, they don't know what they need. We need to, like, we'll have to tell them, we need to capacity build and like tell them what they could use or tell them what they need. We've just always operated under the theory, and as we've talked with more people, most people know what they need actually, and they know their problem. And that's how we've tried to structure the platform, where the starting point is you just share your problem. You don't need to know exactly the type of vendor that you want, and you don't need to know, you don't need to do all the work to go find them. But if we can lower that hurdle to just give people space to express the problem they're experiencing and what they desire, that we can bring relevant solutions to them. So that's like the first part that I think is a misunderstanding, is just needing to listen to people better and not assuming, oh, they don't know what they need, so let me tell them that they need what I have, which I think is a trap that a lot of people trying to sell things fall into, is they don't start off listening. And I think nonprofits also get hounded by vendors. That was something we came up against really early on, was even though we were trying to be like the solution to that and help them not have to engage with a million different cold emails and spam calls. Apologies, loud siren going by. To not have to engage with a million of those like outreaches that they get on LinkedIn or cold calls. I heard stories of people that disconnected their work phone because they got so many exclusively got cold calls from vendors. And so that was one of the value props we thought we could provide, but it was hard for us to not also seem like a vendor that was reaching out and crowding their inbox or whatever. So I think that was part of why we landed on trust and community building as like the most paramount thing we had to start out with, to not just, because people would tell me, oh, just buy an email list and just start emailing people. And that's how a lot of vendors go about it in the space. And I knew we had to do things differently. So I think that desire for trust and that like needing to feel like my friend or my peer is there too, and that like the community is here and that you're like a part of the community, you're living into the values that we have as nonprofit staff and leaders. And I think that is so much more pronounced in the nonprofit space, the like trust needs, and that's why we're talking about community today, because I need to feel like you're in the community to really engage with you.
It's so funny, Mitch, as you're talking, I'm getting like PTSD from my days as an ED and getting like an inbox full of random cold emails. I'm like, who are you? How did you get my information? And I was just like delete, right? I was much more likely to filter on people that my friends had recommended than I was to ever open a random cold email. So let's talk about this, because actually I think trust is the key here. And trust, when I think about nonprofits, it extends to so many things. It extends to the clients that we serve. It extends to our donors and our board members. And so it's not surprising that we also operate that way with our vendors. How have you thought about or implemented trust as the centerpiece of your engagement with either your nonprofit partners or your vendors? Because it seems like you've done a great job of building that community. What are the tactics behind that?
Yeah, I think first off was a recognition that even with your first question, how did you get here? Because you didn't quote unquote come from the nonprofit space. So a recognition that like I had to be really careful, and us as a team had to be careful about coming in and being like, nonprofits need to do XYZ, like kind of a preachy tone that I've seen a lot of from other people or companies. And I think, if you have worked in the nonprofit space for 20 years, then maybe you can do some of that like call out style of content. Was never going to work for us. And so we started from a place of like, again, listening and centering the nonprofit voice and user in everything we did. And so all of our content was about lifting up the stories or struggles of real people that we spoke with or real people I met with. And my role was more of like a storyteller and sharing like the challenges people have and hopefully how Pond is solving them. But then other people kind of see themselves in those experiences, and it's not about us. It's really about the community. And I think that's a real big pillar of community building, is you kind of like need to lose if you're the host of that community or you're an organization or a company, you kind of want to fade into the sort of like Homer Simpson into the bushes, like fade into the background to some extent, because you really want to center the audience that it's all about. And so that's, we started a podcast series called The Kids Table. And that was because in all these conversations we'd have, it was this sense of people put me at the kids table, like this kind of chip on your shoulder. Why am I less than if I work at a nonprofit? And just sort of naming that and then empowering people to talk about it and acknowledge that, oh, wow, people are really missing out on all the value I bring to the table by putting me at the kids table. And that was really the tone of all the conversations we'd have. And we also did them by location. So we started off in my hometown in Fort Wayne, where we interviewed 12 nonprofit leaders, and having that like density within a certain area was really interesting because your listeners would span people that are like in that community as well as folks at nonprofits. But we would just hear from people like, that really changed how I thought about nonprofit work. I'm usually just getting solicited for donations, and it's rare that I'm taking the time to understand the work from the inside and all the value they bring to it. And I think that humanizing that helps lower misunderstanding or stereotypes that you may put on things. So all that work, I think, resonated with people to help us get over that hurdle of a baseline assumption like, oh, you don't know me, you don't come from this space. And so it had to be genuine, and it wasn't quick, and it's still ongoing. Like I said earlier, like I got that question this morning, so it still happens. But you just got to be consistent and keep showing up in that same way where you're a listener and like actually listening and then acting on what you hear and asking, how you can do better, asking for feedback. I think if you're building community, especially if you're starting like we did from scratch, I think that's just the only way to be, is you've just got to be super engaged and listening, and acting on the feedback you get. And that really builds trust for people.
Okay, so you just said a lot there. I'm going to lift up a couple of things that I think are particularly important here. So, number one is the value of being the guide. So, within the nonprofit context, and I see this a lot, is when nonprofits talk about themselves as the hero of the story, it's very off-putting. Like, I think we really need to position ourselves as the guide. And the hero is, can be our clients, the hero can be the donor, the hero can be our volunteers. But the more that we can showcase the real stories of actual people where we are simply the Yoda, if you will, I like being the Yoda, the more people trust us because we're not out there talking about ourselves with an agenda. And the second thing that you said that was really powerful for me is the idea of value, because I think so often in the world, nonprofits are not seen in the same way as the for-profit sector. And then we start to see ourselves that way, right? So one of the things that I do a lot in training is I talk about the value that nonprofits are bringing to the table. And I'm like, you're not begging, you're not a supplicant, you are exchanging value for value. And once people actually realize that A, they do have value, and B, they're allowed to claim that value, it just changes the whole paradigm of like, of course, you're doing valuable things in the world. This doesn't happen without money, but the money doesn't make the change without you. So that's the third thing. And then that's the second thing. And the third thing that I would love for you to talk about is this role as convener, because I think at the end of the day, we all have to understand what value we're bringing to the community. It sounds like your real value is around convening people. Talk about how you've done that and what the value you've seen has been for the community.
Yeah, I think because things are so fragmented in the space, I also hear about a lot of isolation. I think that the people that generally are coming to Pond and like seeking help on the projects they're searching for, it's because this thing probably landed in their lap that they had to solve. And so many organizations are in that run lean mentality. And so they end up being kind of on an island, even if they are in a larger organization or they just are at a smaller one. And I think particularly during the pandemic, you just had a lot of people feel like they were dealing with really hard challenges and they didn't really have any help and or that much like oftentimes buy-in from their organization. Like these things just got put to the bottom of the list, but were really high impact and important to them in their role. And so bringing that kind of audience together, you're providing huge value by building bridges between isolated people that I just really love to start to see come alive. We've done some of that through in-person events where we, especially around podcast launches in that city, we'd like bring the guests together and then have other people come that kind of in their networks and meet with each other. And we did one for our Philly season. And I remember there was like a table of 4 people that were like doing really similar work, one in West Philly and one in North Philly. And it was like, they literally never met each other. And I'm like coming from out of town, bringing these people together. And you see the power of that happening in person. We also see that happening on like a local level. We've also seen that happening when, a series of, at the beginning of the year, we started doing weekly panel discussions on LinkedIn. And you'd have people, the chats were just like lighting up every time we did one of those. And people would be meeting each other, starting to have conversations offline because they'd express a problem, someone else would agree with it, and then they'd have a person to go talk to about it. So those like micro connections that you're seeing happening really have butterfly effects in like both expanding the value of your community and like bringing more and more people into it. And they sort of view you, like you said, the guide, or kind of like an anchor. Once you've met someone through another person, it's kind of always attached to that person or an organization. You always have an affiliation with that, that is positive. And I think that is huge in trust building and people just seeing the value that the community offers.
One thing that you said too that I think really bears repeating is that trust does not happen overnight. And I think the mistake that people make, especially in fundraising, is that they rush to the transaction. They rush to the donation without having built the trust and the relationships. So talk a little bit about, like, how have you thought about the lead time in building trust? Because I think when we're impatient, when we're in the transactional mindset, we just think like, I'll put this thing up, I'll like send out the letter and like all the people will give without having done the work. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was chuckling because I'm thinking back to when April 2020, when I'm like trying to start this company and kind of starting from scratch. I knew a few people in the sector, but definitely not a big network. And yeah, I can remember just getting frustrated, like things weren't happening faster. And it felt like I was just having lots and lots of conversations and it wasn't going anywhere. But all of that was building so much important groundwork by having like genuine conversations with people, asking them like what help they needed, like where their biggest challenges are, and then reacting to that in the kinds of products we were building just keeps people in your orbit and kind of expands it more and more. So it does happen really slowly. And I think for anyone that's starting from the ground up in community building, just like invest really heavily in those first couple of relationships, because, and then this is sort of just conventional startup wisdom, like you would rather have 10 rabid fans that are just like obsessed with everything you do than 1,000 people that are like, oh, that's cool. And so it's tempting to think like, okay, but I need 1,000 people, but that's just a few steps down the line. You really got to invest in those first few people that you connect with. And so that's what I've always tried to do is, especially when we were all just totally stuck remote and virtual, trying to keep that list of like, who are the people that have been engaged with me and interested, like keep giving them feedback, keep trying to catch up with them, not in a pesky way, but just like really investing in those relationships and seeing how I can help personally. And that sort of translated to the company and the brand over time. So that is definitely one is to start small and invest in those people. And I just think that clarity of sort of your North Star also really helps anchor people. So, if you're just out there, like I'm interested in nonprofit work. And so that's just like what you're like, I want to pick your brain. So let's hop on a call. It's like nobody ever wants to hear that. So the more specific you are and sort of clear of like, I really want to solve this problem with how vendors connect, how nonprofits connect with their vendors. And I think there's a marketplace solution and I'm just trying to figure out how we do that. So anyone who's lived that challenge or that experience of like the email full of spam or the like building the Excel spreadsheet to compare a bunch of tools, like they get that and it like affects them on a visceral level. And so they associate that with you and they know that's your thing. And so you're being clear about that. That's really, really powerful to be building trust with people, is not just because whenever someone reaches out to pick your brain, just even that offer sounds so transactional. It's like, I want to get
and also like I get these emails all the time. I'm like, that sounds painful, like having your brain picked, right? Because I think the thing that people have to think about is like, respect my time, but also tell me what's in it for me, like offer some kind of value because my time is valuable.
Yeah. And then the second thing I always try to think about is just consistency. So it's the clarity and consistency. And it doesn't need to be like, Ray and I don't need to be trying to talk to you every week or like taking up a bunch of your time. But things like LinkedIn or your newsletter, like those are just really powerful one-to-many ways to like keep people up to date. Like we can talk more about LinkedIn because that's just the specific channel where I've spent a ton of time and found a lot of interesting success. So many people read what you post, even if they don't like or comment on it. You will be shocked at how far reaching it is because the content's pretty thin on the platform. So the more consistent you are, it really reaches a far audience more than you would think.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir. I think LinkedIn is the most underutilized platform. I tell everybody this, and all of my students are like, I don't know about LinkedIn. I'm like, it is a gold mine. So if you do not like money, stay off of LinkedIn.
If you don't like gold, then stay away from the gold mine, I guess. And then the last piece that I would say that these are like the three pillars to me. It's clarity, consistency, and transparency, or vulnerability. I think of those kind of interchangeable, and that's different for everybody. And sometimes vulnerability is a privilege, right? So like people need to have like the safety and security to be able to be vulnerable, and in a professional setting you might wonder where the line is. So that's a delicate thing. But the more people, I think the goal is people just want to see you as a human being. They want to experience some empathy for what you're doing or going through on a personal level, which is really important in like professional community building. And we can dig into that more, but I just think people got to see you as a human. If you want trust, those are the three things you need: are clarity, consistency, and transparency.
Let's talk about that, because I think one of the things that I see again and again with nonprofits is it's almost like they're scared to claim an edge, or they're scared to claim a strong personality, or they're scared to claim personal things or vulnerability. And I just think that's what makes life interesting. So tell me a little bit about how you think about an authentic voice and being, for lack of a better term, a personal brand, right? I know it sounds so icky to say, but you know what I mean.
It's kind of cringy, but it is that is what it is. And if you're not into, like, brand is happening. You can either be intentional about it or not, but brand is the thing that's happening. And I think that's part of the challenge you pointed out in the nonprofit space in particular. Is it is hard for people, especially if you're a founder or an ED or executive at a nonprofit. I think it is really hard to establish personal brand outside of your cause and organization. It's like, do I sound like I'm not 100% in on the mission if I'm talking about something else? And there's sort of this anxiety about being a human outside of the job that, you feel like people, that's all they care about, especially in a space like LinkedIn. But you're so right. I think my approach, I've always just been, even when I was in finance, I was probably like always pushing the envelope a little bit on like not adhering to all the norms, or not like, I wasn't interested in fitting into all the stereotypes and like, marching to the beat of my own drum. But even in a place like that, that's what drew clients to you. And that's what made people want to sit next to you at the dinner, right? That's like how you succeed in that field and build relationships. So I think I got a hint of that when I was working in banking in a relatively like buttoned up world. So I just felt like once I was doing my own thing and I was just out in the open and in the wild, I was like, I don't have any.
In the wild.
I don't have
You're free range Mitch.
Yeah, I was free range Mitch. I had never used LinkedIn before, but all of a sudden there was probably a specific post I saw. I had a friend who started a nonprofit called Project Healthy Minds. And it was all about mental health resources for the masses, like making it really clear what's out there to help with different mental health challenges, and structuring it as a nonprofit, but kind of operating like a tech company. And we just had a bunch of interesting conversations on mental health. And I was like, well, that's a starting point for me. Like, I've struggled with anxiety for most of my life, and I've been in therapy, and I've like gone through a lot of hardship dealing with these things. And so I just got out there and was like, every Monday, I'm going to do a mental health Monday post. And this was still like pretty peak pandemic. It was like December 2020. And so I just think people were like, yeah, I feel the same way. I've never seen this in my like work feed, like people talking about this and sharing real stories and doing it in a thoughtful way. And it's not like, you're not like glamorizing trauma or things that rub people the wrong way. It's just like genuine, real experience. And as people react to that and engage with that, it sort of like kept extending my rope in a way where I was like, oh, cool. Like I've sort of got bandwidth to talk about a lot of things. And I can be pretty upfront about, what it's experiences of discrimination I've had as a gay person in different settings. And like that really resonates with people and they want to hear more of that. And it invites other people to do the same. And so that is what's been really interesting for me about honing in on my authentic, like professional yet like authentic voice, which is a interesting balance to strike. And so what I do, just practically speaking, like tactically, I love writing. So for me, writing is an outlet. For some people, that is a chore. And so the idea of posting on LinkedIn a bunch is like really overwhelming to them. And that's okay. You can find your own, either your own pace or what you like to share, what you like to do. For me, I love writing. And so what I'll do is I don't overthink it. I'll just start writing things out. And the concept of a LinkedIn post for me is like a good framework. It's like the length, and I know the pace of it and how I like to write it. And so it's just a good way for me to get thoughts down. And I try to just be like non-judgmental. And then I like let it sit for a minute and come back and I'd be like, oh, that might be like a little harsh. Like, who's this benefiting? That's a question I always ask. Like, if you're going to try to be like a little spicy or aggressive, like who's it serving? Is it really serving someone? Like, are you just trying to ruffle feathers for the sake of ruffling feathers? Like that's the kind of second review I'll do. And then I just sort of structure when I want to post that or when it will be well received.
Well, and I just want to highlight here too, because, and I say this a lot, is if you're unwilling to offend someone, then you're not turning anyone. If you're unwilling to turn someone off, then you're not turning anybody on. And I think so often we can be fearful about, oh, what are they going to say? Or people are going to be offended, or my funder's going to be offended, that we pick this very sort of vanilla middle of the road thing. And actually, personally, I can speak about this. I wrote a piece that was very personal after the Post Roe decision. And I got some spicy email responses, but to that end, first of all, like you can unsubscribe, that's fine. But secondly, it was my personal story, right? I wasn't making any kind of comments about what other people should do or not do. End of the day, haters gonna hate. You just got to keep going.
Yeah, someone said that happened. I can't remember the first time someone wrote a kind of a nasty comment on a post I'd written or something. And someone was like, well, that's when you know you've made it. Like once you have haters, that means you're doing something worth like people disagreeing with. And that just sort of stuck with me. And it's really important for community building, by the way, having a North Star, being clear, being vulnerable, that's all related to like being authentic, so that you're drawing the people in that you want, and then they're really engaged and feel seen. And you actually want the people that don't fit out. Like, it's okay. You don't want them in your orbit.
Yeah, 100%. What do they say? Good marketing attracts, great marketing repels. Like if you're not my people, I have to have a message and a vision that is very clear, like a beacon to my kind of people. And if you're not my kind of people, then right away, this is not for me.
It's hard. I think if you've been in a nonprofit or you've been in a big company, there's a lot of similarities of like, you don't want to offend. It's like you want to like, you don't want to upset a client or a donor or anything like that. Like I've been there, and I know so many people I've talked to have been there. Someone described it to me in a way that I've always loved. Is they call it the pink sherbert theory. And it was in relation to email marketing. And they were talking about how unsubscribes are like a good thing. If you're like unsubscribes are happening and your open rates are going up, it's like good. You're like honing in on the right audience. But it's hard. The first couple of times you're like, you're unsubscribed from me. You don't love me.
I know you can't take it personally.
I just had to stop looking at it. But the point was, if you're vanilla, meaning like people might not unsubscribe, but they stop reading it, then it's no point. You don't want to be palatable to everybody. But if you're pink sherbert, some people are going to really not like that. And that's totally fine, as long as you are like finding those pink sherbert diehards. And it's something you've seen on really successful community building platforms, things like Reddit and Discord. It's so cool to see the power of like diehard fans around certain cause areas. But what people might not appreciate is they think just having the cause or just saying the thing means that the community comes to you. someone I spoke with that manages a pretty large Slack community for an HR tech company, but they've got like 20,000 users. And they were like, what people get wrong is they don't think about the community as its own product. That is its own line of business. And you need to give it the same kind of attention and think about it in the same way. What's the pain point you're solving? What's the solution you're offering, right? Like all the same ways you'd evaluate a new product or a new business line, you need to have the same level of intentionality around your community and how you're engaging with it.
That's so good. Let me ask you this, to go back to something that you said, because I think we think about early adopters and sort of rabid fans. I talk a lot about your 1,000 true fans. It's important to nurture those relationships, but how do you nurture them at scale, right? Because you're a small shop. Folks listening to this are all in small shops. What's your solution?
Yeah, there's no perfect answer because you'd love to just like clone yourself, and any advice needs to be weighed against like also take care of yourself. You don't want to be working 24/7, and then you're not going to be serving anyone. So I would give those caveats, but a couple of things that I've always tried to do is like set some time and intentionally set some time aside when people comment on my posts. This is just like, again, the LinkedIn example. You can translate that to your setting. But for me, if someone comments on my post, I'll set time aside to go through and like respond back to them. So it's a light touch thing, but you're still nurturing that relationship where someone feels engaged with. Not to mention it usually helps your like post performance when there's back and forth conversations happening. So it's just like good in general. But the same thing can happen with like an email update that people respond to and respond back to them. Like, don't let that just sit in your inbox. So I think some of those little things go a really long way. And if you do have, obviously maybe not 1,000 people, but if you've got a short list, I do think setting reminders of like, who are some of your closest, be it advisors or just like really meaningful members of your community, set some reminders of like every 3 to 6 months to make sure you like check in with them. And, that's not like at big scale, but you can at least automate it so that you can do that with more people. So I just think that like communication and personalization, wherever you can do it, is great. And just, it's kind of an easy answer, but social media, and I just keep going back to social media and email newsletters as the way to do these things at scale. When you are being vulnerable and personal and human in those channels, it makes people feel like it's more personal to them. Even it helps, I think, keep and build that rapport where they feel like, I can't tell you how many people I've met that have been like, well, I feel like I already know you because I follow you on LinkedIn. Like, what an amazing thing to hear from someone, to know that you're doing like a really good job of communicating what you're about and what you do, which that's the personal brand piece. Is it's not just what you do, it's like what you're about as a person, that you can really cultivate in people over time. And that's very scalable.
Yeah, I'm going to double click on all of that. And I'm going to add something that I tell all of my clients: little notes. I have built my entire career off the back of little notes. Do not underestimate the power of the handwritten note. Your mom was right, because especially these days, all I get in the mail is crap, right? I just get bills and I get crap. What an amazing, actually, someone wrote me a thank you note, a handwritten thank you note last week. And I was like, this is incredible. Like, I'm really going to remember that. So it takes a little, 10 minutes out of your day, but it's worth doing. 2 more questions from me. You've talked about experimentation. Can you talk a little bit about, what do you mean by experimentation? What sort of things have you experimented with as far as community building? And how did you determine which things you double down on and which things were not going to be for you?
Yeah, it's so important because especially if you're like a social person and extroverted, a lot of these things in the community building realm, you could like just want to do because it's fun. And at the end of the day, like, sure, do things that are fun in your own life. But when it comes to like your business or your work, yeah, it's great when things align with being fun, but that cannot be a reason for doing something. Your time is way too valuable. So it's the same thing with like, oh, we're going to get into TikTok because it's fun. It's like, okay, it can be fun and needs to have a business purpose. And otherwise it's like, for what? I always come back to that question. So I think the important thing is setting up a goal and a timeline of like, hey, we're going to try this for X amount of weeks. And we want to see this kind of growth or this level of participation or this kind of sharing or like whatever your metric is that's most important for you in your community building, to see if you carry it forward, and be pretty vigilant about like it's tempting to think there's a sunk cost, like, oh, well, we've already spent a month like building up our Instagram presence and we're going to leave it behind. I mean, I think that's oftentimes the smartest thing you can do. And so especially around marketing, and all of our marketing was basically in growing audience and engagement. We would have a month-long, I can remember one that didn't work. We really wanted to build a YouTube presence. We're like, okay, in this month, we're gonna put a lot of time into taking some of our video content and like splicing together different segments around shared topics and making them like super digestible. We'll give people like extra Pond credits for subscribing to our YouTube channel and these different ways to promote it, and we'll share it and across our different channels, whatever. We were like, as long as we get to 100 subscribers this month, then we'll like know we hit success. And we got to like 44 or something. And it was just like, we weren't seeing people watch the videos, and those things take time. Obviously they take investment, but for us, it was sort of like, we didn't hit an initial goal. It was time consuming, and it doesn't seem to be something that people are like jumping all over from our established audience. So we'll move on. And I think that I always appreciated that willingness to experiment and then like respond honestly to the results. One thing that did work really well was we hadn't established like a formal weekly email newsletter, because we were like, I want to have something to say. I don't want to just be like emailing people for the sake of emailing people. And so we started that in December, because we're like, we also want to try doing some webinars. We did a survey of our audience literally 1 year ago, right to now, and asked a lot of different questions. But one of them was, have you attended a non-mandatory professional webinar in the last 6 months? And 95% of our users had. We're like, okay, these people like webinars. It doesn't matter if I like them or not, it matters what the audience likes. And so we're like, okay, well, we wanted to do a webinar. We need a way to market them. Let's try to set up some email marketing initiative first. And then one of the first things we can promote is our first webinar a month later. And so that was the sequence, and it worked really well. And we were seeing open rates go up, subscribing rates go up, attendance at our webinars go up, and we were doing them every week. We ended up continuing on for 6 months weekly, until we decided to try just like some different models. But over that time period, we set out a goal. We had reasons why, right? It wasn't just like a random guess. We got data that said this is important to our audience. We invested in it, and we're intentional. We didn't rush into it. And then we continued to respond to what was working or what people liked.
And what you say is so important that I think a lot of nonprofits maybe forget, is that you have to be responsive to your community, right? Because I think so often we think these ideas are like, oh, people are going to love this, right? They might, or they might not, but gathering the data and actually surveying the audience. I say this a lot. Like, I can't buy something online without getting a survey in my face. Rarely does that happen with nonprofits. I think as nonprofits, we have to be willing to survey people and ask opinions. And, maybe 10% of the people respond, but like, you're getting data.
Yeah, I think surveys are powerful. Nothing's more powerful than like one-on-one conversations. And it can be so hard because you don't want to bother people. I don't want to bother a donor again. But combining data with anecdotal stories and evidence is really powerful, because it just brings that human element in. And if you just get people talking, that is so valuable. And I think on the art of how to ask, and I'm not an expert at this at all, but I've tried to get better at it. The art of like the user interview is really amazing when people do it well. And even when you try out some of the strategies, it's really interesting to hear what people say. I mean, even recently, I've been trying to do some user interviews with funders or people, major donors, people that are kind of on the funding side of this market. We sit between nonprofits and vendors, but we've had some conversations with funders that might be able to actually like provide capital for projects people are seeking to fulfill on the platform. That would be interesting. But we want to make sure if we're doing that or pursuing that, that we're not just for one person that asks this one question. We want to make sure there's some shared need or problem or pain point we can solve on the funder side that makes that transferable and scalable in the space of why they would come to Pond to do this thing. But through those conversations, it's been fascinating to just not say that, not like, hey, we're thinking about doing this thing. What do you think? And I did a lot of that when I first got started with the startup. I was just, early on, where I would say, hey, I'm going to build the Expedia for nonprofit vendors. Like, what do you think? And people would be like, great, and there's a great book called The Mom Test that I send to like everyone who I talk to about this. But it's the whole premise is like, you don't go to your mom and say like, Mom, I've got this great startup idea. What do you think? Because what is she going to say? Like, oh, that sounds great, sweetie. You can do anything. But you want to be like, hey, Mom, like, I know you cook dinner every night. Like, how do you find your recipes? Oh, and like, when have you found the best recipes? When is the worst? When is it the best? When was it easiest? Or like, when is it hardest to actually make the thing? Or, so you're getting at like an idea for a new recipe app or whatever, but it's from her sharing her experience day to day. And you just want to get people talking. And I think you can do the same thing with donors. You can do the same thing with employees. You can do the same thing with board members, like anyone where you're trying to solve for pain points. You can't just ask, well, tell me your pain point. The nuggets of information you get from people just like starting to talk is so valuable. And those conversations are going well if I'm talking very little. That's like should be the goal whenever you're doing that kind of interview.
I love that. I also think there's an interesting creative tension though here too, because yes, you want to be solving for people's real pain. And I also think about, the Henry Ford thing. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? So I think there's some art and science around really designing for people's problems, but also seeing a bigger vision that they may not even know that they want or need.
Yeah, and that is a great, that is the exact reason why you can't just say, what's your pain point? You got to like ask more contextual questions. The one with I loved asking donors, like what is a like grade A donation experience look like for you? And like, when has it not been as good? And it was interesting to hear from so many people that they generally didn't have great user experiences donating. Like,
Oh my gosh, Mitch,
it
that is a whole other conversation. I 100% agree. And then people wonder why their retention rates suck.
Yeah, and it's because again, it's hard to do at scale. So it's like the community building translates so directly both to like stakeholders or clients or people you're serving with your work and your donors, and sometimes together. But you can't it is a product in and of itself. So you need to identify who are you serving with this community, and then really get to the problems they're solving, and then be an authentic like engager and participant in the content around that community.
All right, Mitch, we're at time. This has been such a helpful conversation. I'm going to make sure that we put joinpond.com in the show notes. Are you okay if folks connect with you via LinkedIn?
Please. I am generally very loud on there for a written platform. So love to chat with people and engage, and yeah, feel free to connect there, and look forward to seeing more of you.
Great. And we'll also make sure to put in a link to the mom test, because it's very useful. So thank you so much, Mitch. Thanks for all you do. Good luck with Pond. I'll see you on LinkedIn.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.